When you open the Bible and begin to read, you might think you're stepping into a stream of history with real people, real events, and real promises. But perhaps you haven't seen it all. Perhaps you're only seeing the surface, while the deepest layer has yet to be revealed. Because there is something strange. The major events in the Bible, from the creation of Eden to the flood to the covenant with Abraham, all happened right on schedule, not early, not late. A rhythm sustained throughout, as if an invisible clock was operating in the background of human history. But that clock doesn't measure by hours, days, or seasons the way humans do. It measures by sacred cycles, weeks, Sabbath years, and especially Jubilees, 49-year cycles in which God intervenes to restore, to set free, and to realign order. Have you ever wondered, why did the flood happen in the 13th year after the watchers fell? Why did Abraham receive the promise in the 14th cycle? Why were the Israelites brought out of Egypt exactly in the 50th year, the Jubilee of liberation? Could it be that every event was preordained, not just in God's plan, but in God's time? Genesis recounts these events, but it doesn't tell you when they occurred in the sacred rhythm. It tells the story, but conceals the underlying structure of time. And so you might think of these events as isolated incidents. But the Book of Jubilees is different. It not only tells the story, it places each event precisely within the sacred calendar. A calendar not measured by the sun, but by covenant, not written by man, but given by an angel on the summit of Mount Sinai. And if that is true, if every promise, every judgment, every divine appearance has its sacred hour, then a question pierces your soul. Are you living in that rhythm, or have you unknowingly drifted from the covenant clock? There is one thing you'll never find in the book of Genesis: the exact timing of when every event happened. You'll see Eden, but not how long Eden lasted. You'll read of the flood, but not when it occurred in God's appointed timeline. You'll hear God calling Abraham, but no one tells you what year of the covenant cycle it happened. Genesis tells the story, but stays silent on the timing. Jubilees does not. The Book of Jubilees opens up a completely different dimension. Time is no longer the backdrop. It is the backbone of all sacred history. A structured calendar divided into 7-year weeks, Sabbath years, 49-year cycles, Jubilees, where each event happens exactly when it's meant to. Not just miracles, but scheduled interventions. Creation took place in 6 days, and the 7th was declared holy. But few know that even then, according to Jubilees, angels were already keeping the Sabbath in heaven. From the beginning of humanity, time had already been divided, and divine law was established right within Eden. But mankind forgot. That's why, on Mount Sinai, when Moses thought he was only receiving the 10 Commandments, an angel appeared. Not just to give the law, but to return the sacred memory, the recorded timeline from creation to Exodus, according to the calendar of the covenant. That book, called Jubilees, was not a human invention. It was a scroll of heaven written down by the one God chose. And then it disappeared. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too clear, too detailed, too inconvenient for a theology that wanted to preserve ambiguity. When the early Christian councils chose which books to keep, Jubilees was excluded, not for doctrinal errors, but because it demanded that people live on schedule, no more delays, no more excuses. But the book didn't vanish completely. It was preserved in the shadows by the Ethiopian priests, where the Bible still holds 88 books, where time is still counted by celestial and covenant rhythms. And today, that scroll is returning to complete the unfinished picture, to speak what Genesis kept silent. The sacred hour of the covenant has begun counting again. When the Israelites stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, they saw lightning, thick clouds, and heard the sound of the trumpet. But they didn't know that on the mountain top, where only Moses could ascend, a meeting took place beyond human comprehension. Moses didn't just receive commandments carved in stone. He was given a scroll, not written by human hands, but recited by an angel. The heavenly scribe, as the Book of Jubilees opens. That book doesn't tell a new story, but neither is it merely a copy of Genesis. It is the original, with specific times. If Genesis is a river, then Jubilees is the map, marking every turn, every bend, every timestamp where God intervened. The angel recounts everything from the beginning, but not as a memory. Rather, through a sacred time system, beginning with the first day of the first week, of the first year, of the first cycle. Every event, from creation to Joseph's death, is placed precisely within Jubilee cycles, Sabbath years, and 7-year weeks. A record that doesn't miss a single day. And that's what makes this book so different. It doesn't give you space to imagine freely. It gives you structure. It doesn't let you interpret history emotionally. It forces you to see history through God's order. Every patriarch's life, every journey, every sacrifice is framed within preordained times established before the foundation of the world. Why does this matter? Because if everything was recorded before it happened, then God is not reacting to humanity. He is leading it. And if you live in such a world where time doesn't drift aimlessly but flows with purpose, what happens when you miss the rhythm, when you live out of season, when you offer a sacrifice out of time? Jubilees is not just an ancient book. It is a reminder. The covenant calendar is still counting, and Moses, the leader who brought the people out of Egypt, was not just the receiver of the law. He was entrusted with God's clock, not to measure time, but to live by divine timing. When reading Genesis, you might think the fall happened almost immediately, that Adam and Eve were created, lived in the garden briefly, then sinned. Everything seems to pass quickly, making Eden feel like a fleeting mirage, a heaven that closed before it could breathe. But Jubilees tells a different story. In that text, we learn that Adam and Eve lived 7 years in the light of Eden. 7 years is not just a number, it is a complete cycle. 7 years to live in sync with creation. 7 years to be taught by angels. 7 years to learn how to keep the Sabbath, distinguish the clean from the unclean, and walk in the covenant God established from the beginning. There was no darkness in those years, no fear, no shame, only a pure order, where humans lived in their rightful place, not as slaves, not as gods, but as entrusted stewards walking in humility. And then something happened, but it didn't happen suddenly. According to Jubilees, the fall was not a rash act. It was the result of a prolonged disruption in rhythm. In the 8th year, after the first cycle ended, something began to shift. Satan, named directly in the book, didn't just tempt with words. He attacked the structure of time. He broke the sequence. He led Eve to eat the forbidden fruit out of season, right when humanity was being invited into a more mature stage of the covenant. The fall, therefore, was not just sin. It was the result of stepping out of sacred time. Have you ever wondered, why was God so strict about a piece of fruit? It wasn't about the fruit itself. It was because the act represented something much larger, a decision to separate from God's rhythm and create a schedule of one's own. And when the rhythm broke, the light withdrew. Eden didn't vanish instantly, but it began to close, layer by layer, moment by moment, until man no longer sensed God walking beside him. Then he knew he had lost the sacred hour. We often think that the law was given at the time of Moses, that before Sinai there were no clear commandments, no Sabbath, no sacrificial regulations. Abraham, by common belief, was someone who believed but didn't yet keep the law. But Jubilees shatters that assumption, and what it reveals might transform how you understand the covenant. Because Abraham, according to this book, kept the law before it was ever written. He didn't invent it. He didn't follow intuition. He was taught by the angel of God every single instruction: how to distinguish clean and unclean animals, how to offer sacrifices at the appointed times, how to give first fruits, how to count weeks, keep Sabbath years, and especially how to honor the Sabbath weekly as an eternal covenant. And he lived by it for his entire life. Jubilees makes it clear that God tested Abraham not only by asking him to offer Isaac, but before that, by entrusting him with a complete set of commandments never before recorded. And Abraham obeyed them all by faith, as one who walked ahead of the law, not waiting for the law to start living rightly. Imagine this. Before the Ark of the Covenant existed, there were stone altars built in the right places at the right times. Before there were priests, there was a father teaching his son how to distinguish sacred offerings. Before Moses led the people out of Egypt, Abraham lived as a set-apart people, right in the midst of the nations, simply by living according to the covenant's timing. Abraham didn't establish a religion. He restored the calendar. And for that very reason, God chose him, not only to be the father of a people, but to re-establish the rhythm lost since Eden. That's why he's called the father of those who believe, because he believed and he lived it, not waiting for written law, not needing proof. He believed so deeply that he aligned his entire life to the invisible clock that only faithful souls can discern. You believe you are a descendant of Abraham? Then ask yourself, are you living according to the sacred calendar he kept, or counting your time by the world's way? In modern life, we measure time by clocks and civil calendars. Work hours, holidays, school years, tax deadlines. Everything has its time, but few ask, where did this calendar come from? And does it match the rhythm of God? The Book of Jubilees answers that question with bold theological clarity. It declares, God has his own calendar, and it does not align with the way humanity is counting days and years. From its very first chapter, the Book of Jubilees divides time into 7-year weeks, called week years. Every 7 of these week years, 49 years, form a Jubilee cycle, and after each 49-year cycle comes the 50th year, the year of release, the year of restoration, the year when the covenant is renewed. Every major event in the history of salvation happens right on schedule. According to Jubilees, Adam fell in the very first year after living 7 years in obedience to the law. Cain committed his sin during the following week. The Watchers, the fallen angels, were sent to earth in the 10th week. The flood came in the 13th year, and Abraham received the promise in the 14th cycle, precisely in the 3rd week of the first year. Nothing happened by chance. There were no coincidental moments. Every time God acts, it is on time, like a landowner who knows exactly when to plant and when to harvest, like a conductor guiding the orchestra with every motion, every rising and falling note. Time, in the Book of Jubilees, is not aimless. It is kept, counted, and measured according to the covenant. This is not a side detail. It changes the entire way we understand sacred history. God is not merely responding to evil as it comes. He is actively and periodically intervening at the exact appointed times, and those who live according to his calendar will see that intervention. You cannot live in covenant if you do not know when the covenant is unfolding. And if you've ever felt like your prayers go unanswered, perhaps it's because you're living out of sync, out of season, outside the year of release. Not because God doesn't hear, but because the sacred hour hasn't come yet, or because you no longer recognize it. The Lord looked with favor on Abel's offering, but not on Cain's. Anyone who has read Genesis knows that line. For thousands of years it has been explained as Abel was more sincere, Cain was more selfish. Or Cain offered fruits, Abel offered lambs. Perhaps God preferred blood sacrifices. But Jubilees offers a completely different understanding. In chapter 4 of this book, we learn that both brothers knew the laws of sacrifice. Not only did they know how to offer, but they also knew when it was permitted to offer. God does not ask for emotion. He establishes a sacred rhythm where every offering must be made in its proper cycle, season, and divinely appointed day from the very beginning. And Cain broke that. Cain not only chose the wrong type of offering, he gave it at the wrong time. He selected his own timing. Whether consciously or unconsciously, he was saying, "I'll come to God when I want to." Abel, however, according to the Book of Jubilees, kept the first fruits feast at its appointed time. He offered the first fruits on the designated day and selected a spotless firstborn lamb right in the first appointed covenant cycle. The difference was not just in the offering, but in the rhythm. One walked according to the sacred calendar, the other made up his own. And that's why God did not look with favor on Cain's offering. Not out of hatred, not out of injustice, but because a covenant built on sacred timing cannot accept an act that is out of sync. And what was the result? Cain became angry, not with himself, but with his brother, as if the inner dissonance within him could no longer tolerate the presence of someone living in tune with the covenant's clock. From there, the first blood was shed, not merely out of jealousy, but because of a clash between two rhythms, one who walked in divine order and one who rejected it. The story of Cain and Abel in the light of Jubilees is no longer just a moral tragedy. It becomes a warning of the consequences when a human life falls out of sync with God. And what is frightening, Cain was not punished immediately. He was allowed to live, but removed from the sacred timeline. The covenant calendar continued to count, but he was no longer within it. When the flood receded, many think Noah's story had ended. The ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. His family stepped out, a rainbow appeared, and God promised never again to destroy the earth with water. That's how Genesis tells it. But the Book of Jubilees reveals much more. Noah wasn't just a survivor. He was the keeper of the covenant, the one chosen to re-establish order, not only of population, but of time. After stepping out of the ark, the first thing he did was not build a home, but raise an altar. Not at random, not out of impulse, but on the first day of the first week of the new cycle. He offered sacrifices of clean animals, not only to give thanks, but to re-establish the connection between heaven and earth. And God accepted, not just because the offering was pure, but because it was offered at the appointed time, in harmony with the covenant's rhythm. In Jubilees, God didn't just make a covenant with Noah, He gave him a contract of time, Sabbath years, feast cycles, distinctions between blessed days. Noah was commanded to write it all down and to teach it to his sons, so that future generations would not forget the appointed times of the Lord. A crucial point. God warned clearly in this book that if Noah's descendants forgot the calendar, they would drift from the covenant, and the world would once again fall into chaos. Not because he would punish them, but because without sacred order, all covenants unravel. And so Noah was not just a new patriarch. He was the first Abraham, the one who set the sacred rhythm for a new humanity. He lived like a priest. He preserved the markers of time. And God, instead of destroying, began again the timeline of salvation, counting from the very day Noah stepped onto dry ground. Do you see the pattern repeating? After every major event, God doesn't just forgive, He resets the calendar. From Eden to the flood, from Noah to Abraham, the covenant always comes with a clock. And the one who keeps the covenant is the one willing to live by that clock, even while the rest of the world goes out of sync. Noah, in the light of Jubilees, is not merely a symbol of survival. He is the first priest of a divine timeline being restarted. We often hear that the sin of the Tower of Babel was arrogance. Mankind wanted to build a tower to the heavens to make a name for themselves. But if it was just about building high, why would God respond so harshly? Why strike language and not the building itself? The Book of Jubilees reveals a deeper layer. Babel is not just a story of architecture. It was a rebellion against the sacred calendar. Jubilees records that after the flood, Noah re-established the covenant, including feast years, Sabbath cycles, and 49-year jubilees. All post-flood life restarted from that point in sacred time, and all his descendants, the lines of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were given land, seasons, and years according to the covenant calendar. But in Babel, a group rejected that order. They said, "Let us build a fortress, name ourselves, and not be scattered." The phrase, "not be scattered," according to Jubilees, meant, let us not follow the divinely appointed dispersal of land, generations, and cycles. They refused to submit to the covenant calendar. They wanted to establish a permanent center, independent of seasons, Sabbath, or Jubilee. They wanted to make a calendar of their own. That was the root of Babel's sin, extinguishing the rhythm of sacred history. And God did not act with fire or flood, but through the confusion of language. Because language is how calendars are maintained. When each group spoke a different tongue, they could no longer coordinate a unified system of time to resist the covenant. The rebellious calendar was shattered, and that very act saved humanity from a second fall, not through forbidden fruit, but through a defiant clock. If Eden was where man ate out of season, Babel was where man tried to redefine the season. And in both, the result was a rupture between heaven and earth. The Book of Jubilees reminds us, it is not only faith that keeps you in covenant, but faithfulness to the timing of the covenant. When you count by your own calendar, you're stepping away from God's axis. And if today's world is echoing Babel, perhaps we too are building on the wrong rhythm and need to be awakened before division comes again. When we think of Abraham, the first image that comes to mind is usually father of faith. The man who obeyed when called to leave his homeland, who trusted God enough to offer his son without hesitation. But there is one thing very few know. Abraham was not just a believer, he was a practitioner, and he practiced according to a sacred schedule taught by an angel. According to the Book of Jubilees, in the 14th year of the sacred cycle, Abraham began receiving revelations about time. An angel of the Lord, unnamed but carrying the authority of heaven's scribe, visited him, not only to give the promise, but to teach him how to count the weeks, the Sabbath years, the Jubilee cycles. Each milestone, each day, each appointed festival was handed down with precision, without deviation. Abraham did not ask why. He simply obeyed. He kept the Sabbath weekly, not because a written law told him to, but because he understood the deeper meaning. To rest is to return to the rhythm of creation. He offered sacrifices at appointed times, distinguishing between clean and unclean animals, exactly as the Mosaic law would later command, though Moses had not yet been born. He built altars, presented first fruits, remembered covenant days, like a priest of time itself. Because for Abraham, the covenant wasn't just a promise about the future, it was a way of life in the present. Keeping the calendar was not superstition. It was how Abraham guarded his relationship with God. Never late, never out of season, never offering out of impulse, but according to a system established in Eden, kept by angels and passed down to the chosen. Abraham needed no written law, for he was taught by heaven to live before the law, to become the prototype of covenant living. And if that is true, then the question for those who live after him is no longer, how much do you believe? But, are you living in rhythm? Because true faith, according to Abraham, always walks in step with sacred time, not to be saved, but to stay in covenant. Scripture tells us that when Sarah died, Abraham mourned and sought a burial place for her. It's a touching image. An elderly husband, alone in a foreign land, purchasing the cave of Machpelah as a resting place for the wife he loved all his life. But the Book of Jubilees adds something Genesis does not. Sarah did not die on a random day. She passed on a sacred day within the cycle of the covenant. Jubilees clearly records Sarah died in the 10th year of the 5th cycle, precisely on a feast day that God had ordained as a day of remembrance and transition. It was not a dark day. It was a day that marked the end of a season and the beginning of a new journey within the covenant, and Abraham knew it. He did not only mourn, he followed the proper sacrificial rituals according to the appointed time. He did not let grief pull him out of the sacred rhythm. On the contrary, He built an altar, offered a clean sacrifice, and declared to his descendants that every generation must remember that day not only to honor Sarah, but to guard the calendar of the covenant. To Abraham, death was not random. It was a milestone in sacred history to be marked with sanctification. When he purchased the cave of Machpelah, he was not merely seeking a burial site. He was anchoring a point in time, a place to connect earth and heaven, a reminder to future generations. This day must not pass like any other day. Sarah, the barren woman who became the mother of nations, lived and died precisely in God's sacred hour. And Abraham, the keeper of the covenant, did not miss that moment. He lived his sorrow in faithfulness, and from that very sorrow a signal was recorded in heaven. This man truly understands the covenant, not just by belief, but by living according to heaven's calendar, even in grief. Have you ever considered that death might be a part of the covenant? That there are deaths which do not disrupt the sacred rhythm, but mark a transition between generations, a counted moment on heaven's clock? If you've never thought this way, perhaps it's time to look again at every season of your life. How many things you call loss are actually a closing cycle, so a new promise can begin. We often think that believing in God is enough to remain within the covenant. But the Book of Jubilees presents another condition, subtle yet absolute. One must live according to the sacred calendar, because in the lens of this book, faith cannot be separated from rhythm. And if you live out of sync, you will gradually step out of the covenant, even if your mouth still proclaims it. That is exactly what happened after the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jubilees records, the generations after them did not keep the weeks, did not remember the Sabbath days, did not make offerings at the appointed times as their fathers had done. They still believed in God, still called on His name, but they forgot how to count time according to Him. And so they drifted from the promise, not because of blatant sin, but because they lost connection with the sacred rhythm. To lose the calendar is to lose alignment with salvation. You can do good, but in the wrong season. You can pray, but outside the window of grace. You can believe, but follow your own schedule. And this is the danger of every age, keeping faith, but living outside God's timing. Abraham never did that. He lived in the covenant, not because he was perfect, but because he kept time. He remembered the feasts, the sacrificial cycles, the Sabbath years. And because of this, the promise flowed through him like an unbroken stream of living water. But after him, when the generations ceased to keep the calendar, the covenant began to lose continuity. Not because God changed, but because mankind stopped showing up at the appointed times. And when the promise arrived, no one was there to receive it. When the harvest opened, the field was unprepared. When the year of release came, people had forgotten the key to open the door. Jubilees does not give a new law. It brings you back to the beginning, where time is part of relationship, where you cannot love God if you do not know where He is on the timeline. And the question for each of us, if today is a sacred Sabbath, would you know it? If this is a Jubilee year for your soul, are you living as if it were? If you don't know where you are on God's calendar, how can you know you're still in His covenant? If you look back at the entire arc of history from Eden to Babel, from Cain to the people of the flood, you will see a quiet but terrifying pattern. Every major fall began with mankind drifting from sacred rhythm. Not visible sin at first, but a subtle deviation in the way they measured time. Cain was not rejected by God for lacking an offering, but for offering at the wrong time. He did not respect the preordained timing, as Jubilees explains, and acted on his own calendar. When rejected, rather than returning to alignment, he spiraled further, murdering his brother, who was living in the appointed season. The builders of Babel were not just ambitious. They refused to divide land, tribes, and seasons as God had ordained. They tried to build a fixed center beyond all cycles, where they would no longer be subject to any heavenly calendar. The result was dispersion, not because of the tower's height, but because they rebelled against time's sacred order. In Noah's generation, the situation worsened. Jubilees describes a people who completely forgot the Sabbath years, who no longer offered sacrifices on schedule, who failed to distinguish holy days from ordinary ones. Everyone lived by their own clock, and when humanity collectively drifted from the sacred calendar, God saw no place left to plant the covenant. The flood wasn't an outburst of wrath. It was a reset of sacred timing by water. From Cain to Noah, chaos didn't begin with action, but with disordered rhythm. And the most frightening part, no one noticed. Because when you drift from God's calendar, you can still believe, still do good, but you will be out of season. And when you're out of season, the promise won't come to you. The miracle won't be meant for you, and the covenant will begin to fall out of step with your life. The world does not fall into chaos because God is absent. It falls because people choose their own spiritual time zones and call it freedom. Pause and ask, is the world today repeating the same old cycles where people continue to eat, work, love and pray, but all at the wrong sacred time? If so, then chaos is not judgment. It's simply the natural result of a world no longer living by the calendar of the covenant. In a world disordered by broken rhythms, God doesn't just call for someone who believes. He calls for someone who keeps the time. And that man is Abraham. If Adam was the first to step into God's calendar, then Abraham, according to the Book of Jubilees, was the first to restore that order after humanity had broken it. In an age where nations had begun forgetting the Sabbath years, offering sacrifices out of season, living without distinction between holy and common days, Abraham was taught the entire sacred rhythm anew by an angel. He kept the Sabbath each week, not as a day off, but as a quiet declaration, I live in God's time. He offered first fruits on time with the right type, the right quality, to align with heaven's calendar. He circumcised his son on the 8th day, not earlier, not later, as a way to synchronize his body with the covenant clock. Every act of Abraham was a choice against the world's rhythm. While the nations around him lived by their own seasons, worshipped gods they had named, Abraham lived by the seasons God had appointed and called upon the one no eye had seen. And that is what set him apart. Not miracles, not talent, but faithfulness to the sacred hour. That steady rhythm made Abraham the field where God could plant the seed of promise, like soil well tilled, watered in the right season, awaiting the right month. Jubilees does not call Abraham the father of faith in a theoretical sense. It shows he was the first to live the covenant as a living calendar, day by day, week by week, cycle by cycle. You might ask, why did God choose Abraham? The answer lies not only in his faith, but in his calendar. He lived differently. He counted differently. He understood that the covenant does not wait for greatness, it waits for punctuality. And because Abraham kept the time, salvation history could begin again. When Joseph was sold into Egypt, many thought the covenant had been interrupted, that the sacred timeline, starting from Eden, restored by Abraham, had been broken in a culture of idol worship, where Pharaoh was king and the sun was God. But the Book of Jubilees reveals a quiet yet powerful truth. Joseph did not lose the covenant calendar. Though sold into slavery, though living in a foreign land, he maintained the sacred rhythm, like one who keeps fire alive in a desert. Joseph kept the hours of prayer, not by Egypt's military watch, but by the times Abraham once used to call upon God. He remembered the cycles of feast days, even with no temple, no priesthood, no community to join him. He lived alone, but lived by heaven's time. And that is why God was with him. Not because he was handsome, not because he was smart, and not because he suffered. Scripture says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and everything he did prospered." Jubilees helps us understand why. Because he lived by God's calendar, every season of his life bore fruit. Joseph kept the festivals in secret, kept the Sabbath when no one around him knew, obeyed the laws in silence, and these small acts made him the central bridge of the covenant, from Abraham to Jacob, and eventually to the nation of Israel. When he became prime minister, he didn't conform to Egypt's rhythm. Instead, he brought Egypt into alignment with the covenant. He stored grain according to 7-year cycles, not just because of a dream, but because he understood the weak years, as Jubilees describes. His strategy, his storage, his distribution was a living theology of time. Joseph was not just a historical figure. He was living proof that even in exile, a person can keep the covenant, if they keep the sacred hour. And that speaks to us today. You don't need to be in Jerusalem to live in step with heaven. You may be in the middle of a modern Egypt, but if you remember the Sabbath, if you listen to the seasons of the soul, God will be with you, as he was with Joseph. One of the questions that often drives people away from faith is, why doesn't God intervene? Why didn't he stop Cain from killing Abel? Why didn't he stop Joseph's brothers from selling him? Why didn't he immediately rescue the Israelites from Egypt? But the Book of Jubilees offers a perspective that is both stunning and deeply revelatory. God is never late. He acts right on schedule, not early, not late. From Eden to Egypt, every miracle, every promise, arrives exactly on time in the sacred calendar. The Sabbath must be kept. The weeks must be counted. The Jubilee cycles must be measured. And when the exact year, exact week, exact day arrives, established by God from the very beginning, history is turned. It's not that God forgot. It's that humanity forgot the time. The sacred calendar, according to Jubilees, is not a minor detail. It is a forgotten theological pillar. A pillar that once upheld the entire cosmos, but was replaced by agricultural calendars, political timelines, and work schedules. And ever since humanity started living by its own clocks, it began to assume that God had withdrawn. In truth, he remains perfectly on time. We just no longer know how to count. That's why Abraham did not complain when the promise delayed. He counted the cycles. That's why Joseph did not despair in prison. He knew the sacred hour had not yet come. That's why Moses was called at age 80. because the seventh cycle had reached its fullness. When you understand the theology of time, you stop asking, "Why hasn't God acted yet?" Instead, you ask, "Where am I on his calendar?" And perhaps the pain you are bearing today is not a sign of abandonment, but a signal that you are drawing near to the sacred hour. God hasn't intervened because he is keeping his promise right on schedule. We are not forgotten. We just need to relearn how to count. We still read the Bible, we still pray, we still worship every week. But perhaps we are doing all these things out of sync, out of season, outside of the appointed times required by the covenant. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes something that may seem small, but is foundational. If the sacred calendar is not kept, then the covenant, even if present, cannot live. Because the covenant is not merely a document. It is a series of appointed times, a rhythm of life measured from before the foundation of the world. If you arrive late, even with zeal, the door may already be shut, not because God rejected you, but because you were not present at the hour of grace. And that is what's happening in today's world. We no longer live by God's rhythm. We live by work hours, fiscal years, exam seasons, vacation schedules. We measure our lives by deadlines, not by Sabbaths. We celebrate holidays based on the market, not by the holy cycles. And then we ask, why doesn't the covenant feel real anymore? Not realizing we've stepped out of sync with the calendar of promise. God still keeps the covenant. But if no one arrives on time, who will receive it? Abraham was blessed because he lived in season. Joseph was exalted because he understood the hour of deliverance. Israel came out of Egypt because they arrived at the Jubilee year. But if today no one counts by the sacred calendar, who will see the door open? If your faith feels cold, if miracles no longer happen, if prayers seem to disappear into silence, it may not be because God is absent. It may be because you've changed time zones without informing him. The covenant is not dead, but it needs people who know how to keep time like the patriarchs once did. People who know that some moments don't repeat, that some appointed times, if missed, do not come back. And if you never relearn to count, you may walk your whole life and never enter the promised season. If you're off the calendar, you're off the promise, and maybe, just maybe, it's time to return to the sacred hour. When Moses walked alone up Mount Sinai, he did not just enter the realm of revelation. He entered God's time, where every second, every moment carries divine purpose. And there, amidst the thunder and the cloud of glory, he did not only receive the commandments, he was entrusted with the full calendar of the covenant. The Book of Jubilees is clear. An angel recounted the entire history from creation, every event, every feast, every Jubilee cycle, and gave him a command that could not be ignored. You shall write down all these things for the children of Israel, and for any foreigner who enters my covenant. Not just for the ancients, not just for the chosen people, but for every generation, for everyone, for any soul who wants to live again in the covenant. That means, for you, you may be living in a modern city with no temple, no priest, and no one to teach you about Sabbaths or release years. But that does not stop God from placing you back in your rightful place within the calendar of salvation, if you are willing to change how you count time. Because the issue is not whether you belong to Israel. The question is, Do you belong to the calendar of the covenant? From the beginning, the covenant was never just a relationship. It was a rhythm of life. God doesn't just promise, He promises with timing. He doesn't just love, He loves in the order of time. And when you enter the covenant, you don't just receive faith, you accept to live again according to heaven's rhythm. That is why the Book of Jubilees is not written to ancient Jews, but to every generation. It doesn't just preserve memory, it hands over heaven's clock to anyone brave enough to live differently. No one is forcing you to start counting again. But if you find yourself praying and hearing no answer, if the promise never seems to arrive, if you're living by the world's calendar and still feel empty, the issue may not be your faith. It may be your rhythm. God has never shut the door of the covenant, but that door opens at specific times. And if you don't know when sowing season is, you'll never see the harvest. The sacred calendar still exists, on time, quiet, precise, and it is waiting for you to count again. The sacred calendar does not move on its own. It was written by God, but it requires people living by it for it to operate. Eden could not exist unless Adam kept the command. The covenant could not breathe unless Abraham lived in time. The promise could not unfold unless Joseph stepped into the sacred hour. And today, the promise continues, but the sacred calendar is waiting for someone to take their place. If Abraham was called to restore the covenant, then who is being called today? It might be you, not because you're special, but because you've begun to sense the dissonance. You feel the world around you buzzing with noise, but lacking rhythm. Your schedule is packed, but your soul is hollow. The holiday seasons pass, but you no longer feel the meaning. Everything keeps moving, but you're not sure where it's all going. That's not coincidence. That's a sign you've begun to realize you're living outside the sacred rhythm. And just like Abraham long ago, you're not being called to start a religion. You're being called to keep time again, to live a week that includes a Sabbath, to celebrate seasons not based on markets, but on the covenant cycles, to measure time not by digital clocks, but by the breath of your soul. You don't need to understand everything. Abraham didn't. But he began with one thing: obedience to sacred rhythm. He stopped on the right day. He offered sacrifices in season. He rebuilt altars at the exact moment when the world was dancing to the rhythms of false gods. If you've listened this far, maybe you're not just a viewer. You're being awakened, not by a blinding voice, but by the subtle stirring of a sacred clock inside your heart. It whispers, "It's time to return to the hour of the covenant." Because if no one keeps the calendar, the covenant will continue flowing, but no one will be ready to receive it. And if someone out there is still waiting for a season of deliverance, they are waiting for a timekeeper to take their place. Someone who lives rightly, someone who doesn't chase time, but lives within the appointed time. That person might be you. You may be living in a world that's obsessed with time. Alarms ringing on cue, meeting calendars sent the night before, appointments at 9 a.m., done by 10, lunch from 12 to 1, 7 hours of sleep. Everything seems perfectly timed. But in the midst of all the time you're keeping, have you ever paused to ask, what is God's hour today? The Book of Jubilees does not speak of time as an abstract flow. It maps out a concrete, sacred schedule where every week, every Sabbath year, every Jubilee cycle is a milestone in the covenant between heaven and earth. This is not a calendar just for Israel, but for every generation willing to listen and live by the covenant. And the shocking truth is that calendar still exists, but most of humanity no longer counts by it. You might attend worship on time, pray at the appointed hour, but still live outside the season of the covenant if you're using the world's calendar to measure God's presence. You might feel like He is absent, not because He abandoned you, but because the sacred hour arrived and you weren't there. Abraham was not chosen because he did more. He was chosen because he arrived on time. He offered without delay. He kept the Sabbath precisely. He marked the days of circumcision, dedication, and remembrance on schedule. And through this, he lived in a divine order that others had forgotten. That truth still applies to us today. You may be out of sync and not even know it, not because of sin, but because of forgetfulness. Forgetting that some hours belong not to labor or meals, but to God. Forgetting that some seasons are not born from markets, but from the covenant. Forgetting that every life has a sacred cycle, waiting to be reclaimed. So if today your faith feels tired, your prayers feel dull, your soul can't touch the sacred, maybe the issue is not your heart, but your calendar. The sacred calendar is not gone. It's waiting for someone brave enough to remember, brave enough to pause and ask not, "What's my next meeting?" but "What is God's hour asking of me today?" If you've made it this far, perhaps you felt something stir inside. Not a new idea, but an old memory, a sacred rhythm your soul once carried but hasn't lived by for a long time. Like Abraham, you don't need anyone to tell you this is true. You just need to listen, and some part of you knows you've been out of sync, but you can return. So, don't keep this to yourself. Don't let this video pass by like another piece of content. Don't let the spark that just lit be buried in your playlist. If this call has touched you, do something. Something small but real to mark that you're starting to live differently. Maybe it's writing down a fixed Sabbath day amid a busy work week. Maybe it's setting up a prayer schedule, not based on feeling, but on covenant rhythm. Maybe it's sharing with a friend, not to argue, but to remember together God's hour. Or simpler still, leave a comment below this video. Write what, in this journey, made you pause. What sentence made you weep? What details struck you with awe? What moment did you feel named? Because this is not just a video. This is a summons, a signal sent to those still keeping watch. Those who know that if the world is in chaos, it's not from a lack of holiness, but because no one is keeping time. If the sacred calendar has been forgotten, then someone must rise and begin to write it again. That someone might be you. And if you want to walk this journey with others, click follow. Not for the algorithm, but because we need to live together in a new rhythm. A calendar born not from anxiety, but from covenant. Not from control, but from trust. Not to do more, but to live deeper. Your old calendar may be full, but you can rewrite yours in the light of the covenant. And you'll discover, when you live by God's hour, every moment has meaning, and your life will no longer drift. It will count down toward home. Amen.